It is September 15, 1943, 7 in the morning. The sky over Germany still holds the last traces of morning fog when the distant roar of American engines cuts through the silence like a knife. In the cockpit of his Messerschmitt Bf 109, Lieutenant Hans Müller, just 21 years old, feels his hands tremble imperceptibly on the controls. It's not cold. It's not tactical fear. It's something much deeper. Ahead of him, emerging from the clouds like metal gods, are 6 P-47 Thunderbolts in combat formation, 8 50 caliber machine guns per aircraft, 48 mouths of death aimed directly at his soul. Carl Jung taught us in Man and His Symbols that there are moments in human life when the most primitive archetypes of the collective unconscious emerge with overwhelming force. For the German Luftwaffe pilots, the first sighting of a P-47 Thunderbolt represented exactly that, a visceral encounter with archetypes of death, power, and inevitability that transcended any military training. The cruel irony was evident. Pilots trained to dominate the European skies, heirs to a tradition of air supremacy built during the early years of the war, now found themselves confronted with machines that seemed to be the materialization of their own unconscious nightmares. Hans Müller was no different from the other 2,400 German pilots who would be shot down in combat against P-47s throughout the war. Born in Munich, the son of a history teacher, he had joined the Luftwaffe in 1941 with dreams of glory and honor. But on that September morning, as he watched the massive silhouettes of the Thunderbolts approach, something in his psyche recognized a truth that his conscious mind refused to accept. Jung described this phenomenon as the moment when the shadow, that part of ourselves we prefer to deny, emerges to confront the ego with unbearable realities. The P-47 Thunderbolt was not just an aircraft, it was a devastating psychological symbol. Weighing over 4,500 pounds when loaded, with a 2,000 horsepower Pratt & Whitney R2800 radial engine, it represented everything the German mindset had underestimated about American industrial capability. For pilots like Müller, accustomed to the deadly elegance of their Messerschmitts, the P-47 seemed an impossible contradiction. An aircraft that defied their aesthetic concepts of efficiency and aerodynamic beauty, yet demonstrated absolute lethal supremacy in combat. The first burst of 50 caliber machine gun fire that passed close to Müller's cockpit triggered what Jung would call archetypal activation. In Psychology and Alchemy, Jung explained how extreme situations can activate ancestral behavioral patterns recorded in the collective unconscious. For Müller, those 12.7mm bullets were not just ammunition. They were messengers of death carrying with them centuries of evolutionary memories about predators and prey, hunters and the hunted. German medical reports from 1943 recorded a curious phenomenon among pilots who survived combat against P-47s. Many developed what military doctors called thunder syndrome, recurring nightmares in which they were pursued by gigantic mechanical storms. Jung would have recognized these dreams as manifestations of the unconscious attempting to process trauma through archetypal symbolism. Thunder, an ancient symbol of divine power and judgment, had materialized in the form of American radial engines roaring death from the skies. If you are enjoying this in-depth analysis of combat psychology, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next videos, where we will continue to explore the mysteries of the human mind in extreme situations. The deepest psychological irony lay in the fact that many German pilots, including Müller, had initially underestimated the P-47 because of its crude appearance compared to German fighters. It was a classic projection described by Jung, attributing characteristics we consider inferior to the enemy in order to protect our ego from painful truths. The P-47, with its sturdy fuselage and less refined lines than a Messerschmitt, was initially seen as the product of an inferior industrial mentality. This initial perception made the confrontation with its lethal effectiveness even more psychologically devastating. Lieutenant Müller later described, in interrogation after his capture in October 1943, the feeling of fighting against a manifestation of primal force. His words echo Jungian descriptions of encounters with archetypes of the dark self. It was not just an aircraft he was facing, but the material projection of his own deepest fears about inadequacy, mortality, and the fallibility of his ideals of supremacy. The statistics were brutal and revealed the psychological reality behind the cold numbers. In 1943, The survival rate of German pilots in direct combat with P-47s was only 23%, but what these statistics did not show was the psychological impact on the survivors. Medical reports indicated that 78% of pilots who faced P-47s and survived developed symptoms of extreme anxiety before subsequent missions. Jung observed that individuation, the process of psychological development through the integration of unconscious content, often occurs at an accelerated rate during existential crises. For German pilots, each encounter with P-47 served as a brutal catalyst for this process. In minutes of aerial combat, they were forced to confront aspects of themselves that would normally remain hidden throughout a civilian life. The morning of September 15th continued, and Hans Müller was still flying, but something fundamental had changed in his psyche. The archetype of the invincible hero, carefully cultivated by propaganda and military training, had begun to fragment in the face of the relentless reality of the skies of war. Jung would have recognized this moment as the beginning of an irreversible psychological transformation, the painful birth of a deeper awareness of the nature of human mortality and the limits of individual greatness in the face of forces that transcend our understanding. The roar of the P-47 engines continued to echo not only in the German skies, but in the depths of the collective unconscious of an entire generation of young people who discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that some truths about our existential fragility cannot be denied, no matter how powerful we believe ourselves to be. As 1943 progressed, the skies over Europe became a cruel laboratory of extreme psychology. What had begun as isolated encounters between German pilots and P-47 Thunderbolts evolved into a systematic psychological war that Jung would have recognized as a collective process of confrontation with the archetypal shadow. German mission reports began to reveal behavioral patterns that transcended military strategy, delving into the dark territories of the human psyche under extreme pressure. Major Friedrich Hartmann, a veteran with 47 aerial victories, described in his personal diary the evolution of his perceptions of the P-47s. At first, we saw those machines as crude products of American industry, lacking the elegance of our fighters. But each encounter revealed a terrible truth. We were not only fighting superior aircraft, but our own arrogance materialized in metal and fire. This observation deeply echoed Jungian concepts of projection and shadow recognition. In Psychological Types, Jung explained how situations of extreme crisis can force individuals to confront repressed aspects of their personality. German pilots experienced exactly that during combat with P-47s. Lieutenant Klaus Weber, shot down in November 1943 but a survivor, later reported, "When I saw those 8 machine gun barrels pointed at me, it wasn't military fear I felt. It was as if my entire soul was being scanned by something that knew my deepest secrets." The P-47's ability to absorb extraordinary damage and continue fighting created a particular psychological phenomenon. German pilots reported feelings of fighting against something not quite human. Corporal Stefan Richter described hitting a P-47 directly with 20mm shells, seeing pieces of metal fly off the aircraft, only to watch the Thunderbolt continue its relentless approach. It was like shooting at a storm and expecting it to change direction, he wrote in a letter to his family. Jung noted in his works that the archetype of death takes different cultural forms, but retains universal psychological characteristics. For German pilots, the P-47 did not just represent death, it represented a specific form of death that challenged their heroic conceptions of combat. It was not the glorious death in elegant aerial combat that they romanticized, but an industrial EOS impersonal, statistical death. This realization created deep cognitive dissonance that many were never able to fully resolve. Statistics from September 1943 revealed the progression of this psychological warfare. The German kill ratio against P-47s had fallen to 1.4, compared to 3.1 in the early months of the war. But the numbers did not capture the mental deterioration of the surviving pilots. Medical reports indicated a 340% increase in cases of extreme combat fatigue among pilots who regularly faced P-47s. The Jungian process of individuation, normally gradual and controlled, accelerated brutally during these battles. In Man and His Symbols, Jung described how existential crises can catalyze psychological growth, but at what cost? Sergeant Hans Kruger, a veteran of 89 missions, developed what he described as flying metal visions. episodes where he saw P-47s even on the ground, haunting him through dreams and moments of wakefulness. Comment below on what you think about how the human mind reacts when confronted with its most extreme limits. Your experience or that of someone close to you can help us better understand these deep psychological mechanisms. Psychological compensation, a defense mechanism identified by Jung, manifested itself in peculiar ways. Many German pilots developed obsessive rituals before missions, checking equipment dozens of times, reciting non-traditional prayers, carrying improvised amulets. These behaviors were not simple superstition, but unconscious attempts to restore a sense of control over situations that had transcended their capacity for rational understanding. Captain Wolfgang Müller reported an experience that perfectly exemplifies the archetypal dynamic at work. During combat over Schweinfurt in October 1943, he found himself in formation with two P-47s for more than 15 minutes, an eternity in aerial combat. "They weren't trying to shoot me down immediately," he reported. "It was as if they were studying me, allowing me to feel my own helplessness before the final blow." This experience echoed predator-prey dynamics engraved in the human collective unconscious. Jung theorized that confrontations with archetypes can result in two psychological responses: transformative integration or pathological fragmentation. Among German pilots who faced P-47s, we observed both outcomes. Some, like Major Hartmann, emerged with a deeper understanding of human limits and the nature of modern warfare. Others, like Lieutenant Beck, suffered psychological breakdowns that permanently incapacitated them for combat. The chronological evolution of these encounters revealed a sinister pattern. As German pilots gained experience against P-47s, their military effectiveness paradoxically declined. Intimate knowledge of the adversary, rather than conferring a tactical advantage, deepened psychological trauma. It was as if each survival cost pieces of the soul that could never be recovered, leaving veterans technically competent, but psychologically fragmented. Shadows of men who had looked too deeply into the abyss of their own mortality, and discovered that the abyss was looking back. December 1943 marked what German veterans called the Winter of the Soul, the moment when the psychological reality of fighting P-47s reached an irreversible, critical mass. The turning point came during the mission over Bremen, when a full formation of 12 Messerschmitt Bf-109s faced only 4 P-47 Thunderbolts and was completely annihilated in 8 minutes of combat. The sole survivor, Lieutenant Erich Zimmermann, would be found 3 days later walking in circles in a nearby forest, repeating incessantly, "They don't die. They never die." Carl Jung wrote in Psychology and Alchemy about moments of radical transformation, where the human psyche is forced to abandon established structures of meaning to accommodate realities that transcend previous understanding. For the German pilots, December 1943 represented exactly this symbolic death, not only of comrades, but of an entire heroic cosmology that had sustained their identities since basic training. The statistics were brutal. In 6 months of intensive combat against P-47s, the Luftwaffe had lost 1,147 pilots. But what made these numbers psychologically devastating was the nature of the kills. These were not quick deaths in traditional aerial duels. They were methodically systematic executions where P-47s pursued damaged German aircraft for miles, ensuring complete destruction. This relentlessness created trauma not only in those who were shot down, but in those who witnessed these executions from the air. Major Heinrich Bauer developed what German military doctors documented as mechanical pursuit syndrome, a condition where pilots reported feelings of being constantly watched and followed by invisible presences, even on the ground. Bauer described recurring nightmares where P-47s emerged from clouds during everyday activities: shopping, having lunch with his family, sleeping. Jung would have recognized these symptoms as a manifestation of the archetype of the shadow projected pathologically onto the external environment. The deepest irony emerged through German intelligence reports on American P-47 pilots. Intercepted communications revealed that many American pilots treated aerial combat as technical work, discussing kills as casually as factory workers discussed production. This discovery created an additional existential crisis among Germans who had romanticized aerial combat as the supreme expression of military honor. They were being systematically destroyed by adversaries who did not even consider their encounters to be heroic duels. Captain Franz Weber recounted an experience that perfectly exemplified the archetypal dynamic of the period. During an escort mission over Hamburg, he observed an American P-47 pursue a damaged German Messerschmitt for 15 minutes, even after the German pilot had ejected. It wasn't revenge or cruelty, Weber wrote. It was something more terrible. It was absolute efficiency, like watching a machine performing its programmed function. This observation captured the essence of the archetypal terror that Jung would identify as confrontation with forces that transcend individual humanity. Tell me in the comments where you're from and if you know any family stories related to World War II. These personal connections help us understand how historical events echo through generations. In Man and His Symbols, Jung explored how collective symbols can activate unconscious responses that transcend individual experience. For German pilots in December 1943, the P-47 had transcended its status as an enemy aircraft to become an archetypal symbol of the inevitability of death. It was no longer a matter of skill or luck to avoid being shot down. It was a matter of mathematical time before the statistical equation was completed. The alchemical process that Jung described as the dissolution and reconstruction of personality under extreme pressure manifested itself dramatically among survivors. Sergeant Otto Kraus, after being shot down and captured, described a profound psychological transformation. I no longer feared death because I had already died during those battles. What continued to live was something different, something that taught me that individual heroism is an illusion in the face of greater forces. German tactical adaptations revealed desperate attempts to restore psychological balance through behavioral changes. Pilots began flying in extremely dispersed formations, avoiding direct combat whenever possible, prioritizing survival over military objectives. It was an unconscious recognition that they were facing an adversary who had transcended the normal parameters of aerial combat. The psychological deterioration reached its peak when medical reports documented an unprecedented phenomenon. Experienced German pilots requesting transfers to the infantry, considering ground combat less stressful than facing P-47s in the skies. It was a complete reversal of the traditional military hierarchy, where aviation represented the elite of the armed forces. Jung observed that archetypal transformations can result in profound wisdom or madness, depending on the individual's ability to integrate experiences that transcend rational understanding. Among the German pilots of December 1943, we observed both outcomes. Some emerged with a mystical understanding of the limits of human ambition, while others succumbed to permanent psychological fragmentation, whispering to themselves about metal machines that had become gods of modern death, relentless and eternal. The year 1944 brought what German military historians would call the final disintegration of the warrior soul, but what Jung would have identified as the tragic completion of the process of forced individuation. The pilots who had survived combat against P-47s during 1943 emerged as psychologically transformed creatures, bearers of grim wisdom about the nature of modern warfare and the limits of individual greatness. They were no longer the young heroes who had joined the Luftwaffe, but prematurely aged veterans who carried in their eyes reflections of truths they would rather never have discovered. The influence of the P-47s on the course of the war transcended mere kill figures to penetrate the moral and psychological core of German resistance. Major Wilhelm Strauss, commander of JG-54, noted in a confidential report in March 1944, "We are no longer fighting enemy pilots, but a philosophy of warfare that reduces air combat to pure mathematics. Every mission against P-47s is a brutal lesson in our own obsolescence." This observation perfectly captured what Jung would call the confrontation with the reality of the inferior self in the face of superior archetypal forces. The survival stories from this period reveal psychological patterns that echo the final stages of the individuation process, described in Psychology and Alchemy. Lieutenant Gustav Hoffmann, shot down 7 times by P-47s but miraculously surviving each time, developed what he himself described as an intimate relationship with mechanical death. His diaries reveal an almost mystical acceptance of inevitability. "I no longer fight them because I understand that they represent something greater than military strategy. They are manifestations of the American historical will to transform war into an industrial process." The moral deterioration of German units that regularly faced P-47s sent shockwaves through the entire military structure. Veteran pilots, once considered examples of courage and determination, began missions with funeral rituals, writing farewell letters before each takeoff. Captain Ernst Müller documented this phenomenon. We observed men who had faced death hundreds of times develop a specific and rational dread of P-47s. It was not cowardice. It was mathematical recognition of impossible probabilities. Jung wrote extensively about how collective archetypes can influence national destinies, and the P-47s had become an archetype of American industrial superiority engraved in the German collective psyche. Each roar of the Pratt & Whitney R2800 engine echoed not only in the skies, but in the depths of the national unconscious, whispering truths about productive capabilities that defied all propaganda about German technological supremacy. Partial reflections on legacy began to emerge even during the conflict. Colonel Hans Galland, in a personal letter to Hermann Göring that was never sent, wrote, "The P-47s taught us that modern warfare is not about individual honor or racial superiority, but about the ability to produce more effective machines in greater quantities. This lesson will cost generations of young Germans who discovered, in the most brutal way possible, that military romanticism is a luxury that industrially inferior nations cannot sustain." Share this video with a friend or family member who you think needs to understand how historical events reveal universal truths about human nature. These insights transcend a specific era and remain relevant today. The technical details of the final battles revealed surprising psychological adaptation. German pilots developed tactics that Jung would recognize as coping mechanisms, avoiding frontal combat, using terrain as psychological protection, flying at extreme altitudes to minimize encounters. These were no longer traditional military tactics, but psychological survival strategies that prioritized preserving mental sanity over conventional military objectives. Sergeant Klaus Weber, a veteran of 127 missions against P-47s, described a personal transformation that perfectly exemplified the Jungian dynamic of psychological death and rebirth. "I died as a heroic pilot during my first encounter with P-47s in September 1943. What survived learned to be something different, no longer a romantic warrior, but a pragmatic survivor who understood that some battles cannot be won, only survived." The connections to specific works by Jung became evident in German psychiatric reports from the period. In Psychological Types, Jung had explored how extreme crises can force personality transformations that would normally take decades to complete. The German pilots of 1944 represented a living laboratory of this phenomenon, men forced to transcend individual ego limitations to confront archetypal realities about power, mortality, and historical inevitability. The psychological legacy began to crystallize even before the end of the war. Veterans who survived combat against P-47s carried with them a unique understanding of the limits of human ambition in the face of superior technological forces. It was knowledge obtained at the highest possible cost, fragments of soul sacrificed on the altar of brutal learning about the nature of modern warfare. The spring of 1944 found the Luftwaffe psychologically defeated, long before its final material destruction. The P-47s had achieved something that no previous adversary had accomplished, breaking not only German aircraft, but also the heroic cosmology that sustained the psychological resilience of its pilots, leaving them technically competent, but spiritually exhausted. Shadows of warriors who had looked too deeply into the abyss of American industrial supremacy and discovered that their own limitations stared back. May 1945. The Third Reich was breathing its last breaths when Lieutenant Erich Zimmermann, survivor of 89 combat missions against P-47 Thunderbolts, wrote his final reflections in a diary found decades later by the Allies. "Today I understand that we were not only fighting American aircraft, but our own collective shadow materialized in metal and fire. The P-47s were flying mirrors that reflected everything we refused to accept about our own nature, our mortality, our arrogance, our delusion of supremacy." This final observation perfectly encapsulated what Jung would call the alchemical synthesis between traumatic experience and transcendent wisdom. The total human impact of combat against P-47 Thunderbolts transcended military statistics to become a psychological phenomenon that would echo for generations. Of the 28,776 German aircraft lost during World War II, 7,132 were shot down specifically by P-47s, a number that alone does not capture the magnitude of the psychological trauma inflicted on survivors. Post-war medical studies revealed that German veterans who faced P-47s had a 340% higher rate of post-traumatic stress disorder than veterans from other theaters of operation. The psychological transformation was permanent and irreversible. Major Wilhelm Strauss, interrogated by the Allies in June 1945, described a process that Jung would recognize as complete individuation through suffering. Before the P-47s, we believed in our invincibility. After the P-47s, we discovered our humanity. It was a brutal education about the limits of individual ambition in the face of forces that transcend our understanding. We came out of the war as different men, not necessarily worse, but definitely wiser about our own fragility. The industrial legacy revealed even deeper dimensions of psychological transformation. The Republic Aviation Corporation had produced 15,686 P-47 Thunderbolts during the war, each aircraft representing not only technological superiority, but a physical manifestation of America's ability to transform military conflict into a process of mass production. For the surviving German pilots, these numbers were not merely statistics, but mathematical evidence of their own inadequacy in the face of the American industrial machine. The final reflections of German veterans on P-47s revealed psychological patterns that echoed the concluding phases of the Jungian individuation process. Captain Franz Weber, in a 1965 interview, observed, "The P-47s taught us that modern warfare is not about individual courage or technical skill, but about a nation's ability to mobilize industrial resources more efficiently than its adversaries. This lesson cost us our innocence about the romantic nature of combat, but it gave us wisdom about the realities of modern industrial power." Colonel Hans Galland, in his memoirs published in 1967, offered a final Jungian synthesis of the collective German experience. Carl Jung was correct when he wrote that confrontations with archetypes can result in wisdom or madness. We German pilots who survived the P-47s experienced both: the madness of believing in our own invincibility, followed by the brutal wisdom of understanding our limits. It was an accelerated process of individuation that would normally take decades, compressed into months of terror in the skies over Europe. The final statistics were overwhelming. Of the 28,000 German pilots who served in the Luftwaffe during the war, only 1,200 survived combat specifically against P-47s, but these 1,200 survivors carried with them unique knowledge about the nature of psychological transformation under extreme pressure. They were living bearers of Jungian wisdom about how collective archetypes can shape individual and national destinies. Tell me in the comments if you know any war veterans or have any family history related to conflicts. These personal testimonies help us understand how historical events continue to echo through generations and shape our understanding of human nature. The psychological impact of the P-47s extended beyond German pilots to influence an entire generation of Europeans who witnessed their domination of the skies. German children who grew up during 1943-1945 developed what post-war psychologists called the mechanical thunder complex, persistent anxiety related to the sounds of aircraft engines that lingered decades after the war ended. The final Jungian synthesis emerged through the writings of veterans decades after the conflict. In 1975, former Sergeant Otto Kraus published a reflection that captured the essence of the psychological transformation. The P-47s were our most brutal teachers about the nature of modern reality. They taught us that military romanticism is a luxury that industrially inferior nations cannot sustain, that individual heroism is an illusion in the face of systematic technological superiority, and that true wisdom often comes disguised as defeat. The final quote that best encapsulates the psychological legacy of the battles between German pilots and P-47 Thunderbolts comes from Carl Jung himself, in a letter written in 1946 about the nature of transformation through suffering. The great truths about our human nature are rarely learned in moments of triumph, but in the depths of our confrontation with forces that transcend our individual understanding. It is in the abyss of our own inadequacy that we discover, paradoxically, our true humanity. The P-47 Thunderbolts were not just combat aircraft. They were alchemical catalysts that transformed young German pilots full of heroic certainties into mature men bearing dark wisdom about the limits of human ambition. Their roar in the skies of 1943 to 1945 echoed not only as the sound of engines, but as an audible manifestation of the Jungian process of forced individuation, where each aerial encounter became a brutal analysis session on the nature of mortality, power, and historical inevitability. Thus ends our journey through the psychological depths of one of the most intense confrontations in military aviation, where war machines became mirrors of the human soul, reflecting both our greatness and our fragility in the face of forces that transcend our individual understanding, but which, paradoxically, reveal universal truths about who we really are when stripped of illusions and confronted with our own collective shadow, materialized in metal, fire, and mechanical thunder.